So I'm going to be focusing, as a slightly different tangent really from the other presentations, but aligning northwest transport, and in that I'm focusing primarily on cars, but we'll touch on other ones towards the end. And this presentation comes out of some provisional carbon budget analysis that we've done with the Decarbonate network, which is a collection of various northern universities looking particularly at transport, particularly land-based transport in the north of England. So let me just take the slides to operate. So I'm going to start off by saying that we frame our analysis within Decarbonate very much along the lines of the Paris Agreement. We take that at face value. We assumed that when we signed it that we were honest in our signatory to that agreement, and we can deliver on it. The numbers here are based on the science that really emerges from the IPCC and on the concept of equity, which is deeply embedded in the Paris Agreement and indeed every other international agreement on climate change, going back to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Completely ignoring political and economic sensibilities. So I'm not interested in short-term whims of politics or even economics. That's not to say politics and economics aren't important. Of course they are. They're actually key to this. But the sort of short-term interpretation of these challenges, I think, is actually deeply unhelpful. And I think if you put these together, this reframes a mitigation challenge, which is far more onerous than I would suggest it's been hinted at by some of the other presentations thus far. And I will try to show it goes way beyond the net zero by 2050 analysis. So before we start thinking about mitigation, I think we have to understand our starting point. And this requires some significant humility that we've had the first IPCC report out 30 years ago, 3 decades ago, over 3 decades now. In 2019, emissions were just over 60% higher than they were in 1990. Globally, they've gone down by about 6% during 2020, but 2021 as a result of COVID, but that looks to be bouncing back already. They were still rising in 2019 by about 0.5% or so. So whilst we've heard lots of optimistic rhetoric over the last 30 years, what we've presided over has been really 30 years of abject failure. And I think sometimes we should stop and just reflect on that. We've had 30 years and look where we are now. Emissions are 60% higher. We've emitted more carbon dioxide since 1990 than we emitted as humankind right through our history. So since we've had the IPCC reports, we've emitted more CO2 since then than all of our history. But we often hear the language, and we've heard this, of course, recently, isn't the UK a progressive nation? I hear this when I work in Sweden, you hear it from France and Denmark and so forth. The UK has reduced its emissions by 51%. But actually, if you include aviation and shipping and our imports and exports, so look at the carbon intensity of living lives in the UK, or the UK as a whole, then we've cut our emissions by just under, actually, I think, 15%. So less than 0.5%, just over 0.5% every single year since 1990. And in fact, most of that has only occurred post the period of austerity, really. That's similar for Sweden, France, and Denmark. In fact, all of those three have seen virtually no reduction at all since 1990. The US is up 15%, Norway's up 25%. So let's not pretend that the industrialized countries are in any way showing leadership on climate change. We're not. What we witness, if we stand back and look at this, is failure writ large. 30 years on, we have failed across the board internationally. So what does the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tell us about Paris? Well, I'm going to summarize the whole of this wonderful set of lengthy reports, particularly the science reports, in saying it's actually carbon budgets that matter, not long-term targets. So not net zero by 2050 or net zero by 2045 in Scotland, or some of the other targets that are out there about, not in my term of office, effectively. That doesn't relate to the science. It's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we emit that relates to the science. And actually that brings the whole policy timeframe much, much closer. It's really what we do between now and 2030 in massively cutting our emissions that is absolutely key. And we've known that for years and chosen to fail on this. So how big is this well below 2 degrees C carbon budget? Well, based on the latest IPCC report, SR 1.5, and adjusting that to 2022, January 2022, so making some assumptions about the rest of this year, and focusing here on energy only, recognizing agriculture emissions and so forth are important, but just CO2 from energy. Then for Paris, 1.5, really more 2 degrees centigrade. Very approximately, we've got something like 600 billion tons of CO2 that we can dump in the atmosphere from 2022 on through to the end of the century and basically forever. Now, it could be a bit higher than that, it could be a bit lower than that, depending on climate sensitivity, but it gives us a real reasonable enough handle as to the scale of the challenge. But that probably means very little to most of us. But in 2019, pre-COVID, we emitted about 36 billion tons and it dropped to just below 35 last year. So that's about 17 years of current emissions from 2022 that we have before we blow through the budget. And that's at the global level. And we have signed up with this issue of equity absolutely core to all of the climate agreements for the last 30 years. So to translate Paris into UK carbon budgets, we have to think about this equity issue, but we have to play that out in relation to the science and the maths. But we haven't got time to go through that today. So I'm going to simply think of it in a much easier form, which should be familiar to most of us in the north. It's all about pies. What we have is a global carbon pie. And as I say, it's 600 billion tons there or thereabouts from the start of next year. And as I say, it could be 10, 20% bigger, it could be 10, 20% smaller. I think it probably would be smaller with the climate sensitivity issues, but who knows? And we now have to split that amongst every part of the world. And in the language of Paris, we have a very clear division between thinking about developing countries, which does include China, with a income per capita much, much lower than any of the wealthy countries, and the developed countries. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any particular detail, but we first thought about, well, what's a sort of budget that the developing country parties could survive with from a carbon point of view and still actually see ongoing development. And then we thought, well, what's left then for the developed country parties? So we did the opposite to what most people do. We thought about the poorer parts of the world first, because that really fits with the Paris Agreement, and then looked at what was the residual that was left there for the developed country parties. And we played with those numbers backwards and forwards a little bit. Now, of the developed country budgets, we then asked, well, how much should the UK get? Or in particular, the paper we looked at the UK and Sweden, but indeed most of the industrialized parts of the world. And there are ways to split that up. You might split it up on the basis of your population, of your historical emissions, of your capacity to change. And we use something called grandfathering, which is looking at recent emissions and using that as an adequate proxy for economic wherewithal, locked-in infrastructure, population, those sorts of factors. And it was the least worst of the options that are out there, I think. And when you play that out, and you play it out from 2022, you've got somewhere around about 2 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide we can emit from the UK. Now, again, or perhaps in this audience, that means something to us, but that's roughly 5 to 7 years of current emissions. Now, that does include aviation and shipping, but it doesn't include imports and exports. So this is just our territorial emissions, but it does include our international emissions through aviation and shipping. So from those budgets, we then can translate that into our mitigation rates. What rates of reductions do we require in the UK? Well, we need to really ramp up our mitigation to something like 10 to 15% every year. 10 to 15%. Now, we should have started earlier, we didn't. That's why these numbers are so much higher. We need really something like a 70% reduction in our total emissions. That's across all of the energy realm. That's planes, trains, cars, ships, industry, the whole shebang. By about 2030, 70% reduction relative to 2019. So our most recent emissions were pre-COVID, not relative to 1990 or 2000, but to 2019. And we need fully decarbonised energy by about 2035 to 2040. And the language of net zero has been very misleading here, because we will require some compensation for ongoing warming from things like nitrous oxide and methane related to agriculture. And we can't double count that and use it for energy as well, which is what we're doing really currently in virtually all of our scenarios. Why is this so different from what we typically hear with this sort of whole net zero framing that has now become ubiquitous, yet we didn't even talk about net zero at the level we are now just 2 years ago. Certainly hardly even talked about 5 years ago. Firstly, the net zero framing for the UK does not have an explicit global or UK carbon budget. It doesn't work on that principle anymore. It did before, but the latest report has now actively moved away from that. So therefore, it doesn't analyse the UK's fair contribution to Paris. It doesn't think about that in a mathematical and scientific manner. It's much more based upon what they call highest possible ambition. It's heavily reliant on post-2050 negative emission technologies. In other words, our children deploying technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere in very large quantities. And it essentially ignores international equity. It doesn't see the UK as having to do really any more than Rwanda, despite the fact there's a huge difference in historical responsibility and indeed in terms of current emissions. So let's play this back out now in terms of sectors and think about what does this mean for the car sector. And I think this photograph's interesting. I took this a few years ago in Italy. The car behind is a 4-seater. The car in front, the big one, is a 2-seater. That shows what progress is for us. So what's a reasonable carbon budget for cars? Well, let's imagine that we took the UK carbon budget and then we say we split that between every sector on the basis of its current level of emissions. So you, again, a grandfathering approach, and you could do it differently to that if you wanted to. Then we can say for the UK, we have something like 600 million tons of carbon dioxide the car sector can emit from 2022 onwards. And I think currently emissions are probably around about 80 odd million tons a year. So about 7 years of current emissions for the car sector. But the Department for Transport and the Committee on Climate Change think that we should hugely privilege aviation, despite the fact that most aviation is actually carried out by or used, that service is used by a relatively small percentage of the population, 70% of all the flights by 15% of the population. And any 1 year, half the UK population doesn't even fly. Nevertheless, the DfT and the CCC think we should privilege that sector. If you play out the numbers from their analysis, then that would mean that you'd have to reduce the car budget, indeed the carbon budget for hospitals, schools, and every other business as well, quite significantly to compensate for aviation. So you'd have to reduce it to something like 400 million tons. That's probably quite a generous budget. That's 5 years of current car emissions. That's over 15% reduction rate every single year starting January 2022. So what does this imply for car transport? Well, for 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade future, if we want to be honest and go back to the point about face value, that we signed the Paris Agreement and assumed it, we signed it, being honest about the commitments that we were making, then even with a complete transition to EVs by 2030 and assuming a significantly improved grid in terms of emissions, we would still need to see a rapid reduction in vehicle kilometers, something like 40 to 60% reduction in vehicle kilometers. So completely different to any scenario we see out there. It's interesting that if you look at the baseline scenario in the Committee on Climate Change report, they actually see no reduction in vehicle kilometers even by 2035, and they call that highest possible ambition. So what we can say here is that we need stringent demand management if we're going to deliver on our Paris. It is a prerequisite of Paris, but that's true indeed for many, many sectors as well. So to align the northwest land-based transport with Paris, we would have to see a rapid shift from car to public, active and virtual travel within our cities, within our urban environments. So a real rapid shift away from the car. We would need to phase out car ownership. And there's a whole set of reasons which some of my colleagues in Decarbonate have been working on behind this, but there's a whole set of reasons why we need to move away from car ownership and much more towards a rental model. It works well on a grid point of view, it works well in terms of charging infrastructure, it works well in terms of the throughput of cars, and actually it would massively reduce the fleet of cars in the UK. We need to focus on rural charging networks, not the nonsense we repeatedly hear about. We've got to roll out charging networks in our cities and our towns. The idea we move from internal combustion engine cars to EV cars in our cities and towns seems to be a huge lost opportunity in terms of making this transition to a sustainable transport future. We need tight emission standards for the cars that we are going to sell in terms of fossil fuel ones. I think, and when I say tight, I mean way beyond anything we're talking about now. No car above 100 grams from January next year, and tighten that to say 10% every single year. That will rapidly move us away from internal combustion engine cars anyway, and take all of the large, unnecessarily large cars out of the system very quickly. A complete transition to EV or very low CO2 alternatives, I'm not going to particularly pick on the technology, by 2030. So not a partial transition, a complete transition across the fleet by 2030. And that also requires a massive reduction in our electricity emissions, our carbon intensity for the electricity grid. So down to something like 10 to 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. I think it's currently running at 260, something like that. This is all massively challenging and way beyond what we're normally prepared to talk about. And that's because we have chosen to fail for 30 years. And let's be clear, the we is those of us who are high carbon emitters have been involved in this debate for 30 years. We haven't had the courage to interpret the science in terms of what that actually means. And we still are not doing that in 2021, 31 years after the first IPCC report and 19 years after the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We should have acted earlier. And the only reason we're ramping up our ambition today is not because of the scientists or because of the policymakers. It's been driven significantly by civil society. And that civil society has had to come up and push the experts, the academics, the policymakers to actually deliver on the science that we have conducted ourselves. I think is a sad indictment of how we have actually been dominated much more by an economic framing of our society than by one that is much more aligned with prosperity, low carbon, being sustainable and so forth. As Einstein noted, at least it's attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we've chosen to bequeath to our own children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. And I would argue the whole language of net zero by 2050 is just perpetuating that. So thank heavens for the civil society movements that are pushing us beyond that sort of choice of insanity. So on that note, thanks for listening.